The purpose of this video is to finish my lecture on Chapter 1. In class, we ran out of time, so we weren't able to finish my coverage. So this video is simply to supplement the coverage and finish the lecture on my Chapter 1 series. And at the end of our class, we began talking a little bit about concepts of research and also looking at ways that we can be ethical in the research methods that we use in order to make sure that the information we provide is as accurate as possible and provide some real information to those who will use that research for everyday life. So I just want to begin by talking about the scientific method. And one of the interesting things is that in any science, in order for it really to be considered a science, we have to use the scientific method of kind of identifying what the question is, trying to formulate that explanation, carrying out an actual research method in order to really carry the information across in a systematic and clear way, and then finally learning how to actually communicate those findings. And what I would say about this is the first two steps, while a little challenging, are definitely what I would say the easiest part of any type of research. It's steps 3 and 4 that can definitely be very difficult, specifically when we talk about step number 4, communicating the findings. This step can be very difficult because a lot of times the type of research that we do doesn't necessarily provide the finding that we say it does. So in the class, for example, I had everyone in the class, or at least I had 4 participants in 2 different groups in the class come up, and we had 2 group leaders, and then in each group there were 3 different people. And in that scenario, basically what I said is I wanted them to find the most intelligent people in the class. Now, that finding wouldn't actually be accurate, right? Because simply memorizing a sequence of words does not actually indicate that someone is intelligent or not, right? So the results of that, even if they had been one-sided or not, wouldn't really measure what I purported them to measure. So you can see how important it is for us to not only be able to develop an appropriate research design, but to make sure that the results are actually what we are trying to get to, or at least the results that we have are actually explaining the theory that we came up with. So when we talk about looking at creating our theories and our hypotheses, each step is going to help us get move one place closer to creating a true scientific experiment. So first, obviously, we have our theories. Theories are going to be just kind of a broad, non-directional type of question. So for instance, we might say something like, well, I noticed when this happens, this may also happen. But you see, we're not necessarily kind of making a very strong prediction. However, once we move past theories to our hypothesis, this is actually kind of moving beyond just that kind of educated guess. This is actually kind of breaking down the specifics we want to see. So when A happens, I expect B to B to happen in this sequence of events, or we're going to break down what each part of our experiment is, so that it can be defined, and that if someone else wanted to pick up our experimental hypothesis, they could actually use that as a working model to conduct their own research. So all of that to say, sometimes, for instance, let's say I wanted to measure anxiety, and I wanted to see if this new anxiety medication actually helps to reduce someone's anxiety. When we talk about our operational definition of anxiety, we really have to be specific. What does it mean to be anxious, and how do I break that down to something that's actually observable. So it's tapping someone's foot. How I'm going to measure the amount of anxiety they have, or am I going to look at their heart rate? Am I going to look at their pulse ox, whatever. I want to make sure that's operationally defined in a testable way. Finally, when we move into the research phase, we want to know what type of research model we're going to use, right? And so, in some instances, it may be just enough to have some type of correlation, right? Correlation meaning there's a relationship between A and B, right? However, if we want to be able to really use that research to make changes, we often have to kind of move away from just correlational research. We want to move into what's called experimental, which we'll dive into in a little bit. But again, at the onset, we really need to know what type of research we're doing. And finally, once we get results, we want to make sure that we're presenting those results in a clear way and accurately indicating what these results actually mean. So moving into some of the different types of descriptive research is out there, right? So we have descriptive research, we have correlational research, and we have experimental research. So the first one being our descriptive research, this is going to be much more what I would call qualitative versus quantitative. Qualitative means that the information we have provides us kind of a richness of data, but it doesn't actually give us any kind of data that we can crunch. No, we can't crunch the numbers on it. We just know that when this person took this medication, that they say it made them feel this way, or that it kind of gives us kind of a broad amount of information. But again, it's not something we can number crunch and say, well, when someone feels happy, does that mean that someone else who reports they feel kind of happy? Is that half as much as happy is happy? And so again, we have to kind of look at this descriptive research, from a step back, knowing that it's not something we can really crunch. So the first type of research we're looking at here is what's called archival research. And basically in this type of research design, all we're doing is trying to just gather past information about this person or about this this group. And what we want to ask the question here when we look at archival research is who was doing the documentation, such as like college records or maybe we're looking at a child to see if they have ADD, and we just look at what the principal reported the last time they came into their office. And sometimes we have to realize that that person is making a report with the purpose of doing some type of action. So it's not always maybe the most accurate report, but it does give us some information. And so anytime we use archival research, we have to understand that that person was writing that report or doing those records generally with a different stated purpose in mind. Moving into our naturalistic observations, this is very behavioral, meaning that we're just going to look at kind of observations of that behavior. So going back to my ADD example, we're just going to kind of watch that child in the classroom and just compare that child's behavior to another child. Again, we're not actually doing anything to the child. We're not actually manipulating the situation. All we're doing is just making an observation. Moving on to survey research. This is probably the most common type of research we'll see out there. This is when someone comes into into your classroom or into your workplace and says, "Hey, can you take a quick survey about this about this topic or a different topic?" And we kind of answer 5 questions or 10 questions about kind of our feelings regarding that topic. Now, this is a really, like I said, a really easy way to gather research. It gets us a lot of information, but again, it's we're not actually manipulating anything in that experimental design. We're simply just gathering some information kind of quickly. And finally, when we move on to our case studies, what's interesting about a case study is it is definitely gives us a huge, rich amount of information about maybe one person's kind of journey through quitting smoking or something, for instance. But it is not necessarily very generalizable, right? So we can't generalize that information to everyone else in the population. We just know for that person, that's kind of what they experience. And so, again, you want to kind of take it with a grain of salt here. We got to know that that person doesn't necessarily explain every person's, but it does give us a really in-depth investigation and really kind of provides us some rich information about that one person or maybe that small group of people's experience. All right, so we're moving on from descriptive research to correlational research. Now, this type of research is definitely one of the kind of more commonly used forms of research, basically, where we're going to see if variable A has an impact on variable B. So, for instance, I want to see if the number of fans in a baseball stadium is going to change, who ends up winning the game, right? So in that instance, what I would say is the number of fans for the home team increases. Do we see increases in the wins for that team, throughout the season? Now, those two things have some kind of relationship, and that does provide us some insight. However, it doesn't actually give us any real answers as far as why. We just know that there is some kind of relationship, and oftentimes this is where people get in trouble. They begin by looking at a correlational research, and it'll say something like, when people eat candy, they feel less depressed. Like, oh, well, all right, there you go. Therefore, eating candy gets rid of your depression. But that's not really the truth, is it? We just know that these things have a relationship. Okay, and so to kind of show you this for a minute, I want to kind of open this up here and look at the different types of correlational models we have. So, for instance, when we have a relationship like I talked about before, maybe this bottom line could be something like hours of study, and this line over here is maybe the grade that person gets in that class, right? And so what we would say is something like, 0 hours of study will probably be, an F, right? Whereas if we have, 3 hours of study, let me kind of write this here, what we'll see is that maybe that person's grade now is going to go up to, a C, right? And so you can see how as this increases, the amount of time studied, then this line over here is going to increase, right? So the more studying, maybe the higher the grade. And that's what we would call a positive correlation, right? And this is actually a very strong positive correlation, right? This is actually what we would call 1 for 1, right? So for every 1 hour of study, we notice that this is going to go up by 1 value, right? And so this is a very positive, this is a very strong correlation. And then we can start trying to make a statement there is definitely a relationship between these two. Again, we haven't proven that just by studying this means that person's grades are going up. We just know that these things have a strong relationship. And then we have a different type of kind of correlational relationship here, where we might see something like the person's performance on and their ability to drive is here, right? So let's say this is like 100%. This person's 100% ability to kind of pass like maybe a driver's test, and then maybe down here, this may be something like the amount of drinks of alcohol that person has consumed, right? And so you can see as the number goes up here, we'll not notice that maybe their performance is actually going down. And so, that type of relationship is what we would call a negative correlation, right? Not necessarily meaning that the relationship's any less strong, it's just in reverse. So when we have an increase in alcohol, we have a decrease in driving performance, all right? So that's a negative correlation. So just because it's not going in the same direction as a positive correlation doesn't mean the relationship isn't as strong. However, if, for